As we address the issue of housing expansion in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, it's really important to dig deep and address the issue of housing discrimination that occurred along with that expansion. Um, this housing discrimination that took place has a lot of reverberations into modern day society in terms of uh, generational wealth, the wealth that can be passed down among families, and home ownership. The equity gains that are made in home ownership is a vital pathway for that. And so today I wanted to address some of the racial injustice and how it connects to modern day environmental injustice in terms of sustainable housing. So to start, one of the terms you may be familiar with, known as redlining, was actually a federally administered policy. Back in 1933, when we were faced with the housing shortage, the federal government began a program explicitly designed to and to segregate America's housing stock. So the Federal Housing Administration, the FHA, established in 1934, furthered the segregation efforts by refusing to insure mortgages, so refusing to back up the banks who are issuing loans to buy houses in and near African American neighborhoods. So this policy, known as redlining, literally drew red areas on the map where the neighborhoods were predominantly occupied by African Americans, and issued kind of a warning to banks that those were high risk areas and they would not insure those loans that the banks were thinking of giving out. This leads to stagnant inequality. These families being much less upwardly mobile when you're living in a segregated neighborhood where the opportunities are not present, and homeownership options are limited or not available at all. Really great project coming out of the Humphrey School here at the University of Minnesota in partnership with others to actually document these racial covenants that then were written into law in local government statutes based on this racial segregation. So for generations, new arrivals in Minneapolis had to figure out where they'd be welcome, and even after these racial covenants were made illegal, it still becomes a struggle for African Americans to secure housing in white neighborhoods due to some of these historical legacies that are left behind by this policy. So the racial boundaries first established by the covenants are still kind of in place, and breaching those boundaries can actually even be dangerous. So racial covenants are tools that were used by real estate developers to prevent people of color from buying or occupying property. So just a few lines of text written into, in neighborhood associations bylaws, if you will. They were actually inserted right into the warranty deed of the house. So real estate developers would actually write this in with public officials to use private property transactions to build this kind of hidden system of American apartheid, if you will. So this would be a bylaw saying, you can't even sell your house to whomever you desire based on the bylaws that were written into these neighborhood covenants. And so the Mapping Prejudice project is mapping all of those and creating a library, if you will, of these resources. So to bring it into some financial context, home ownership is such a vital tool for creating wealth within a family. And so, this century of government policies to promote home equity, combined with the racial discrimination in home ownership, creates this wealth gap that persists today. And so to look at this chart here, the blue line is actual home prices over the years, and the orange line is kind of working backwards, if you will, to show how inflation it can be adjusted. That orange line could, it's starting from today and working backwards, but if you could readjust that orange line and bring the starting point down, you could see how how much equity is gained through home ownership. You can see the little blip in the graph there from our 2008 financial crisis. We hope we are not repeating history on that. But there are some staggering statistics to accompany this. In 2014, a renter's median net worth was only $2,381, according to the U.S. Census Bureau. A homeowner versus a renter, homeowner's net worth was $205,000. Home equity makes up the majority of that wealth accumulation. And so it's a really important asset to creating the middle class that we can consider to have today. So here, want to move into how this connects to sustainability and environmental justice. The pollution is segregated as well. Studies back to the 70s have pointed to a consistent pattern of who lives near these kinds of hazards: toxic waste sites, landfills, congested highways. Few of us would willingly choose those things as our neighbors or to have them in our backyard. So poor people, folks with lower income, and communities of color have unfortunately been segregated into these areas, and so now there persist these correlations. And so, this pattern of environmental injustice suggests that minorities may contend every day with disproportionate health risks from tailpipe exhaust or coal plants and the like. Other issues about what neighborhoods were targeted for development. Here on the left, you can see actually an overhead shot of the development of the I-94 corridor back when the federal interstate, the U.S. interstate system was being developed. And these interstates, these freeways, when they connected to major cities, had to find a path for this development. And so often times the redlined neighborhoods, the neighborhoods with predominantly African American communities were targeted for this redevelopment. And so not only are you building a system that's dividing a community and separating a lot of the folks in that community from the assets that might just so happen to lie a couple blocks away, but now it's on the other side of the freeway, much less, thousands of people who lived in these homes and apartments lost their homes as well. People who rented were not compensated at all. Those who did own their home often felt they were compensated poorly or not enough, with no assistance for moving expenses or finding a new home. This also happened with 35W and happened in cities all across the country. And so now, not only did we separate these neighborhoods from themselves, splitting them in two, displacing a whole bunch of folks, but now we can correlate this with air pollution being next to these congested highways. And so your place of residence really does determine access to community assets. Majority white neighborhoods have more parks, more generous tree cover. And what we find in correlation is that communities of color have more environmental hazards like landfills or waste burning incinerators or highways. This makes air quality poor, rendering residents more vulnerable to chronic conditions like asthma and other respiratory viruses like COVID-19. So now you can start to see some of these other correlations bearing out in modern day scientific research. Less access to medical care, which translates into higher rates of infant mortality and premature births. Inferior housing stock also makes it harder to weather the public health emergencies. If we're not lending money out to make home improvements, these things can be exacerbated. The schools in these neighborhoods might have fewer resources. So these things can start to compound and build on themselves. And so, like I said, there's lots of scientific literature out there. Some of it done by folks here at the University of Minnesota. In fact, the one at the bottom there, inequity in consumption of goods and services adds to racial, ethnic disparities in air pollution exposure. So what this is saying is that we can directly tie environmental hazards to wealth and consumption. And so this is a study that shows the folks who are purchasing the goods that are creating the pollution are also not having to deal with that pollution. And it's the folks who are maybe not purchasing as many goods and services who are dealing with the pollution. And you can see this playing out in cities as we've just been discussing, but it's also a microcosm of what's happening globally with climate change and other issues. Those who have created the problem, getting rich off of a lot of emissions, are the most well prepared to weather the storm versus low-lying island nations and other developing nations across the world who have not really put greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere, are probably least likely or least able to adapt to the changing climate.